Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for CNO Live, the next big bills inside Carney's policy playbook. I'm told that people are still filtering in, so we'll give you about a minute to settle in, and then we can get things rolling. So, you guys are all doing well? You're all ready for a great conversation?
Yeah, doing great.
Very much so.
Good, good. Yeah, this is really an intriguing time for sure. It's I mean, if you like politics, this is the place to be for sure. You know, lots to watch, lots of developments on both sides of the border. So it's very intriguing for sure.
Totally. And this is where Carney's trying to get his signature agenda
Hmm.
uh, done, right? I mean, this is really where it's all coming together. So
Yeah,
very excited for this.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Okay, I think that we're almost ready to go. So let's get started. Okay. All right. We're ready. I'm David McKie, the managing editor here at Canada's National Observer. Today, we're diving into what's shaping up to be one of the biggest stories in Ottawa this fall, the Carney government's major projects legislation and what it tells us about the Liberal government's broader policy playbook. We'll unpack the political strategy behind these proposals, what they could mean for businesses, what they could mean for communities, the environment, and what to watch for as the year end comes about and a new one begins. I'm joined by a fantastic panel of experts and reporters who have been watching all of this unfold very closely. Darius Snieckus is CNO's business correspondent. John Woodside is our bureau chief. Natasha Bulowski, our parliamentary reporter, who's been tracking the evolving dynamics among Canada's opposition parties. And to round things off, Michael Wernick, former clerk of the Privy Council, who brings an insider's perspective on how major government projects actually get off the ground. Hopefully, he'll give us a good sense of what might be happening around the cabinet table. So, here's how this hour is going to run, and I assure you it'll go by very quickly. We'll start with a short discussion with our panelists, then move to an audience Q&A. You can send your questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll keep an eye on them and queue them up for the Q&A period towards the end. We're hoping to allow for about 15 minutes for that. And before we dive in, a quick reminder. If you like the kind of deep, independent journalism you're hearing today, please subscribe to Canada's National Observer at nationalobserver.com/subscribe. Your support helps us make these events possible. So please, please, please help us out. All right, let's get right into it. I'm going to start with John Woodside. John, you've written a lot about the so-called grand bargain, and I put that in quotation marks. The
Hmm.
hope that fast tracking certain projects will compel proponents to show goodwill by implementing climate-friendly policies. How's that working out?
It's a good question, and I don't think it's going to work out very well. I think the big example of this really is, in terms of compromises being made, is Carney's idea around Pathways Plus. This is essentially the idea that the oil patch can get a new oil pipeline, most likely to the West Coast, in exchange for major investments in carbon capture technology, the Pathways Alliance project. This is, I mean, it's a political minefield. And, we could speak a little bit about this being a way to balance, fossil fuel resource extraction with, in the Carney climate world, carbon capture is kind of considered a clean technology. Really isn't, but, Um, this is sort of the big grand bargain that's on the table. We can see the government trying to balance out quite a few other things right now with, some clean projects like Wind West, while there's some other fossil fuel projects like LNG Canada Phase 2. But I think this grand bargain is very neatly summarized in this Pathways Plus project. Um, for those with any sort of historic memory on this, the first Northern Gateway fight was huge. And Right now, we're seeing Alberta saying that they will step up to be a proponent for this revival. BC Premier David Eby saying he will fight this, and Coastal First Nation saying that they're against it. Um, where that leaves Carney is really the question of the day. And I think that's one of the kind of main things we'll watch. So, when you ask, how's this grand bargain going? I don't think we're off to a very good start right now as far as striking a bargain.
Hmm. Okay. Um, Darius, it's looking like Canada will miss its 2030 legally binding emissions reduction targets at a time when all the political talk, as you know, is about getting the most extraction, getting as many fossil fuels out of the ground as possible. So, what does this mean for clean tech?
Yeah, this feels very much a best of times, worst of times period in Canada's energy transition. As you rightly identify, David, if we look at the Canadian Climate Institute's most recent calculations on our emissions trajectories, we are nowhere near being on track to meet, as you say, our legally binding Paris Agreement tied plans to get to where we need to be by 2030, and indeed off track for 2050. Not that that necessarily factors in a meaningfully way at the moment. So on the emissions reduction front, we are failing as a nation. At the same time, in one week, 3 weeks ago, we had both the Canadian Climate Institute's report and the Canadian Renewable Energy Institute's annual forecast on renewable energy deployment in this country. And on that side, you had a much more sort of bullish and buoyant view, which included around $200 billion going into clean tech, clean economy by 2035, renewables most specifically, a build out of over 5 gigawatts of wind, 2.6 gigawatts of solar. That's enough for about 12, 13 million Canadian homes. So that's substantial. And this should be perceived obviously very much in an optimistic light. So there is this real disconnect. There's this very clear paradox in where we are at the moment. I think that ultimately there is a kind of rising tide floats all boats reality. The power demand growth we're going to see across Canada in the coming years, as those who follow this know, is going to be astronomical. That's before you even factor in data centers. And indeed, we are on the cusp of what could be a market-changing pace and magnitude, market-changing pace and magnitude transformation in this country. So it's a bit like most things in the energy transition. Hope springs eternal. But when you look at the first major projects, as John rightly identifies, a grand bargain that builds credence into a belief in LNG, when most analysts I speak to don't see the market for Asian Canada's LNG to Asia, nor do they see certainly a market in Europe for Canada's LNG. When you look at two copper mine expansions, when you see port expansions, these are yesterday's industries effectively. So there's not much to draw real succor from in that. Now, if you look slightly further down the road and we look at the next tranche of nation building projects, so now we have Wind West, we have maybe some other more hopeful signs that the energy transition is going to really catch light finally in Canada.
Okay, thank you. Natasha, let's put this in the context of the many climate-related promises made by the previous Liberal government and how those are now inherited by the Carney government. One of those commitments was to assess and manage the risks climate change is posing to federal assets, like ports, for example, major infrastructure. The goal of Bill C5 is to facilitate the creation of huge infrastructure projects. So, how does this how does this climate risk factor tee up with the priorities of the legislation?
Yeah, I mean, with all the talk of pipelines, as interesting as that is, I think it has sucked up a lot of the oxygen in the room. And I think it's an interesting kind of underexplored dimension of this major projects conversation. Climate change is here, it's happening, and it's not going anywhere. Even if we do manage to drastically curb emissions, there are certain impacts that are baked in, and we need to be building everything to be resilient to those impacts. And again, with all the talk of pipelines, I think there's a lot of interesting projects that are kind of flying under the radar. Some of those are, things like building roads and port infrastructure up in Canada's north. And it's very, very expensive to replace and repair major infrastructure as it gets damaged and eroded. We've got shoreline erosion, we've got melting permafrost. Those are serious issues. Like when we're talking about building all season roads to unlock, industry, but also, for the benefit of communities. I mean, that's all being built on top of what's becoming a very unstable surface, and that can cause huge issues. So I think that's an element that, we should keep an eye on how and if the government plans to incorporate those considerations into the projects that they decide to fast track. At this point, it's sort of unclear to me whether that is a consideration. We know that there is one of the criteria is that ideally it will sort of help further our climate goals, but the resilience side is a bit different. And last week we saw Northwest Territories Premier R.J. Simpson and several other leaders come to Ottawa and really try to lay out their pitch for what major projects could take place in the North. And a big part of that was positioning those projects around Arctic security. And the deputy premier made an interesting point that, like right now, there isn't a single road where the military could convoy from the southern part of Canada up to the Arctic coast and the Northwest Territories, as well as the energy grid. They're not on the North American energy grid, which I think a lot of us take for granted. And that means that neither is the military when they're in that region. So, they came with this really strong pitch to the feds to develop the North. But again, that's a huge build out of infrastructure in a region that is being hit super hard by climate change. And like you were saying about the audit, David, right now there's a couple federal departments we found are being audited by the Auditor General. And so we can expect a report on that in the spring. And one of those is the Department of Defense, because they just have so many assets, vehicles, runways, roads, training centers, buildings, like the list goes on and on. And so we'll get to see, how these departments are actually doing in terms of whether they've been able to improve resilience, protect these assets, or maybe there's big losses that, that we're going to have to prepare for. So I'll sort of be looking ahead to the release of that audit to see if there's some lessons learned that can be applied to this broader major projects push.
Okay, thank you for that. Michael, as former clerk of the Privy Council, you had a front row seat to many hot political, controversial discussions. As the Carney government grapples with getting projects out the door, take us inside that cabinet room and talk about the kind of pressure that Carney might be under.
Yeah, I think I'd make the room a bit bigger and include the entire caucus. It's basically, for the prime minister to some extent, he's the leader of Team Red, and needs to maintain confidence of his team. So a lot of the tensions will play out in the caucus room as well. I mean, any government is basically you're going to wrestle with two permanent challenges. One is time. You're going to run out of time eventually. The political cycle is very short. The sands are running out towards the next election, maximum 4 years, probably less than that. So you're always thinking about what's going to be on the pool table when the balls stop moving, and I go to the people. And if they're going to the people as soon as next year, like there's not time to get a lot of, big projects out the door. And the other is, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, Canada's regional politics. Like when you're national prime minister, you're juggling 5 or 6 or 7 regional economies, a table of 13 premiers, Indigenous governments playing a big role. The footnote on the North is it's almost entirely covered by modern land claims and self-government treaties. So those governments have to be included in the conversations. So, trying to carve out national interest and national projects in a country which is a sort of spread out and federal is going to be challenged. What I think you're going to see over the next year, 2 or 3 is a lot of lobbying to move projects up the list or to get them added to there's this mysterious other areas of interest that are sort of projects but not quite projects. They started with the low-hanging fruit, and I think you're going to see premiers and caucus members and ministers lobbying to move things up the list and get them into the more urgent pile so that there can be some signs of progress before the next election. And then, the biggest challenge, is a lot of these are private sector driven. Yes, there are some that are public sector, and the Trudeau government had to nationalize a pipeline to get it built. Some will be public-private partnerships. But mostly they're private sector things. And so the final investment decisions are going to be made somewhere else. And the government can create incentives, but it can't force, the investors to proceed.
I'd like to move into a second round of questions, but Michael, I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned, and that's the regional politics, because I can't, for people who are outside the so-called Ottawa bubble, that might not mean as much as it does to us. So can you just expand on that? What do you mean by regional politics?
Well, I mean, everybody's from somewhere, so there's two levels to it. I would guess, just to oversimplify a great deal. I mean, one is the obvious federal provincial premiers tables, and you're seeing some of the early solidarity of start to break down, and premiers become more provincial, lobbying for this or opposing that, disagreeing, disagreements between BC and Alberta. Wob canoes ready to sell out the Ontario audio industry. They're going to start pulling. So there's that kind of federalism tension. But I think what's underestimated is there are 30 cabinet ministers. They're all from somewhere. And they have a political and a personal and a professional background that they're Western or they're Quebecois or they're from Atlantic Canada. And what you tend to think of ministers as the title that they have or the department they're running. And I would say half of the discussion at cabinet is much more about regional dynamics.
And what would be the two big regions we hear about are Ontario and Alberta. And I guess maybe Atlantic Canada as a large region, but would those be the two big regions?
No, I mean, you can dive into this. We could use the whole webinar, but I mean, BC is a big player. It's a big economy. It's vital to the natural resource exporting. It's where the ports are. A landlocked, independent Alberta is going to have to talk to British Columbia. So, it's more complicated than that. So you're going to see different interests play. The regional economies are quite different. It's autos in Ontario and oil and gas in Alberta and so on and so on. So and they all have their sort of way of getting their agendas on the agenda. And if you're a government that aspires to get reelected so you can keep governing, you've got to pay attention to those dynamics, and ultimately you're going to have to win, the most seats.
Mm-hmm. John, how much, talking about those premiers, how much do you think that Prime Minister Mark Carney is banking on support from Ontario's Doug Ford and Alberta's Danielle Smith to give him the kind of political capital he needs to make things happen?
So I think it's really important, not just for the political capital, but also for avoiding things like court challenges that would really complicate the efforts to do anything. We saw that a lot under Justin Trudeau, with Alberta, Saskatchewan, and others really challenging basically anything on the environmental front. And that really slows down your policies and your projects and everything you're trying to do. Carney has put a lot of his own political capital and his own ability to do things fast. And so I think he does need to be very careful about that legal risk that he's facing. I think like it goes the other way too, where having some political support for what you're doing can really help. Of course. But I've been thinking about this recently with Newfoundland Labrador's election this week. And it's a small province, but I think there was a really interesting dynamic that played out there. And so for those who might not be familiar with the province, you really can't understand it without understanding the long and ugly history of hydro boondoggles. Going back to the 1960s, there was this terrible deal for Newfoundland Labrador with Quebec to develop the Churchill Falls mega project. A number of decades later, the province tried to develop its own Muskrat Falls project, kind of spite Quebec will send our electricity from Labrador to Nova Scotia with subsea cables. That also total boondoggle, went off the rails. Cost overruns in the billions that basically required a bailout. And last December, Quebec and Newfoundland Labrador, they signed an MOU to jointly develop Gull Island, another hydro dam on the Churchill River. And that was a major issue in this recent election that just happened this week. And the problem wasn't so much should we do this project or not, it was should we have an independent oversight of this project.
Mhm.
The reason I bring this up is because there's been some suggestion that one of the reasons why the incumbent Liberals didn't want to put it to a lengthy arm's length review was because they sensed this window of opportunity on mega projects could close. They felt like Carney wants to do this quickly. Um, there might be another election it's a minority government, it might have another election in a year or two. If we don't have this deal done, we might not get the federal government to de-risk it for us. So and they lost the PCs who were promising an independent review, swept into power, very narrow majority. But reason I bring it up is because I really do think it speaks to um, this dynamic that we're seeing in the provinces around, are we going to align with what Carney is doing to try to get what we can out of it, or are we going to fight it? Um, there's one other thing that maybe Michael might want to chime in on too, but when we talk about timing of the projects and what's going to be announced, um, this tranche by tranche basis where the federal government announces 5 projects at a time, um, that kind of, I think, and there's been some suggestion of this, I think it kind of gives certain proponents a feeling of, well, maybe we'll be on the next list. And if we're not in the next batch, maybe we'll be in the next batch, and maybe we'll be in the next batch. Kind of a way to keep everyone engaged in the process. Even if there might be some very valid reasons to do it in a tranche by tranche basis. I wonder about the political rationale there too.
Yeah. Before I ask John, Michael to jump in and comment on what John said, I would just ask that the audience get your questions to us, right? So because we will try to get to as many as we can. So fire off your questions. We're recording them, we're writing them down, and then we can put your questions to these very smart people. Michael, did you want to just jump in and have a go at what John just said?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a pretty arbitrary decision what you're going to call national interest or national project. There are always hundreds of projects at various stages of development. There was a major projects management office in the Harper years. There's a clean growth secretariat in the Trudeau years. And there's something like 400 projects at various stages of development that are bigger than 50 million, if I remember my numbers. So they're always sort of moving up and down, different states, so a lot of this is political signaling about, well, this one's important, it's of national interest. But all those other projects they still have proponents, they still have investors, they still have enthusiasts. You've got the whole high-speed rail lobby. You've got, as Natasha said, these aren't all about pipelines. There's lots and lots of infrastructure of interest there. And this is something governments have always dealt with, from the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Trans-Canada Highway, Hibernia, Prince Rupert, Roberts Bank, Centerport, the Gordie Howe Bridge, and so on. I guess what we should remind ourselves of is, like, from first announcements and government relations, sort of hype, to shovels in the ground or containers and ships moving, can be 20 years. Like, the Gordie Howe Bridge was announced in 2004. So, there's a long cycle to things, where you need 9 zeros to describe what's going on. And so, we shouldn't expect, a lot of these kinds of projects to suddenly come on stream quickly. And that's a challenge because, the government may well get things going, which the next government or the one after will be there for the opening ceremony of. But I guess, in a sense, what Carney's after is a sense of urgency and movement. And the underlying driver we haven't talked about is Trump. Trump, Trump, Trump. They would be having similar conversations in Paris, in Tokyo, in Berlin, because people are responding to a whole new era of uncertainty by looking for more autonomy, more self-sufficiency, more resilience in their economy, trying to create more domestic demand because you can't rely on trade and so on. You could be having a version of this conversation in almost any G7 capital right now. Canada is an interesting one because we happen to be very, very, rich in natural resources, and we have export opportunities that the Germans and the French can only dream of. So, but they're all wrestling with the climate change and the energy transition. They're having fierce conversations in London and Paris and other countries as well, and coming to different conclusions. I think what makes the Canadian conversation so interesting, I'll keep coming back to it, is the federalism part.
Darius, you make the point that there's lots of investments being made in clean tech. So what should we be looking for to determine if these investments will be enough to diminish our fossil fuel dependence?
Oh, well, I mean, yeah, that's another question that we could easily chew over for an hour, easily, I imagine. But I think it does. It's an interesting case. I mean, if you look at the hard numbers, and in fact, the government's still relying upon 2024 rather than more recent numbers. But you do have in clean tech, and you have to define this, but broadly speaking, you do have a $240 billion market there. And that's 1.4% of our gross domestic product in of itself. You employ something like 225,000 Canadians are employed purely by clean tech companies or by pure clean tech companies. And there are in the region of about 3,000-ish clean tech companies that go by that name. So there's no question that there is actually quite a vibrant, and I was in Toronto yesterday at the Clean 50, a big awards and workshopping session. Green hushing is the word that we'll have to use. The point is, there's a great deal going on. There are a huge number of boutique investment houses that are spending hundreds of millions backing what they see as technologies of today and tomorrow. The problem fundamentally is, as it's explained to me, that we're not moving fast enough. All these companies are these are genial, innovative ideas that range, far and wide from renewables through to environmental remediation, through to even, direct air capture and so on. But they're not, they're not getting to market soon enough, and these do wither on the vine. They're reliant upon, Canadian grants and VCs who want their payback in 2 years, and that's a very difficult furrow to plow for these small companies. But I do think that, one thing that's really struck me in this process of the major projects process is we were talking initially about these being nation building projects. And yet I think, as Michael rightly identifies, everyone comes from somewhere. So, I think the missed opportunity that's emerging here is that, we should be thinking about how these projects can both, maybe it's an impossibility, you're straddling two very different demands, but, serve regions and serve the nation simultaneously. Talk of pipelines is grossly misplaced. No analyst I speak to says there's any grounds, and we see there's no private money getting behind Daniel Smith's proposal. Across Canada, clean grid that did answer, regional grids that could be bolted on, could be developed across this country, could be fed by obviously new renewables being built up because there is a route to market for these things now. I mean, that is the saner minds that I've spoken to say, this is the way forward, and that would cost less than, say, TMX. Building a cross-country grid. So, the clean tech world is a many splendid thing. It's everything from infrastructure down to the widget makers with the new ideas. But it's but don't believe the naysayers right now. There's a huge amount of money traveling through the sector. Projects are getting built. There are strides being taken. And the really perverse thing in all this, and we can get into this maybe a future webinar. Some of the most advanced and world-leading Canadian companies are all building their pilots outside of Canada, in the States, in Australia, in Germany. We're losing our greatest asset in the people and technologies we're developing because we're not supporting them properly.
It's interesting, Darius, that you talk about stuff still being built. Stuff, believe it or not, stuff is still being built in the United States because many companies are still able to take advantage of the tax breaks that haven't gone away yet.
Well, the trains have less stations, and there's no putting the genie back in the bottle to mix my metaphors, So I think that's exactly right. I think we have to be very careful and we haven't touched on this, but the critical mineral space, again, it's probably worthy of its own webinar. But we are seeing some investments by the United States government in Canadian critical minerals mines and processing and recycling. That is annexation by stealth, right? We need to. I've just finished a piece. It'll be in our newsletter tomorrow on the current state of the critical minerals and rare earth materials sector right now, and it's very much on a knife's edge as to how this is going to go for the country. We have the natural resources, as Michael rightly identifies, but this is not hewers of wood and drawers of water. This is advanced high-tech industrial ecosystems that need to be developed. And we saw the whole misadventure of EVs in this country. It's reflective of the fact that we say alpha, we say omega, and we think the rest of the Greek alphabet is going to miraculously materialize between the two.
When we talk about critical minerals, we talk about natural resources, Natasha. An aspect we haven't talked about much at all, and that is indigenous peoples. There are many groups that will have a huge say. That really was one of the reasons why the Northern Gateway was ultimately didn't make it. So you have spent a bit of time looking into the Indigenous Advisory Council, which is going to be a key part of the major projects process. Can you give us a rundown of who some of these major players are?
Yeah, for sure. Because like you said, it's going to be a huge part of the process. And in the summer, we saw a lot of threats from different nations and different Indigenous leaders who were really unhappy with how C5 was rushed through Parliament with, little to no consultation with them. And part of the remedy appears to be the Indigenous Advisory Council, which Carney appointed 11 members to it in sort of mid-September, and they're going to serve a 2-year term. And the Indigenous Services Minister, Mandy Galmasti, she described the goal and sort of the role of the Advisory Council as, not striving to represent every nation, but more like gathering a variety of people with different backgrounds and perspectives together to advise the government on how communities want to move forward with projects and sort of how best to liaise with communities. Again, it still remains to be seen how this will play out. So I think this is something to watch really closely. But, when I was looking at the council members a bit closer, it was clear that there's a lot of very strong business backgrounds in economic development, natural resources, just entrepreneurs. And a lot of the bios, I found that the federal government really played up that angle in the bios. These people are very accomplished in many areas, but the emphasis was definitely on business and economic development. And that emphasis might not be very comforting to people who are concerned about, ensuring that the federal government doesn't take any shortcuts in its duty to consult and the need for free, prior, and informed consent. But there is a bit of balance on there. At least one appointee, in this case, Treaty 8 First Nations Grand Chief Trevor McCurdy, is on the council, and he was a very vocal critic of Bill C5. And when he accepted the appointment, he did put out a statement ensuring that this is not to be confused with the Treaty 8 nations giving any sort of consent or even consensus on the fact that this council exists in the first place. And he's really trying to bring their perspectives to that table. And then, on the other hand, there's quite a strong industry presence, which, you would expect. We have Crystal Smith, former chief of the Haisla Nation, and she was a big proponent of Cedar LNG, which is majority owned by the Haisla Nation, and that all happened under her leadership. And another big player in the on the business side is JP Gladu, and he's a longtime business leader and long history in the natural resources sector. And he still has some entanglements with the sector. He sits on Suncor's board, for example. So I talked to him. He obviously has a very optimistic view of what these projects can do for communities, and you'll recuse yourself if any discussions around pipelines or carbon capture come up because you sit on that board. But that's sort of the dynamic there. And the big thing I think to watch, and we didn't have any clarity on this when the council was first announced, because that first batch of projects came out and they didn't really need any help to get fast tracked. It was largely symbolic, as people have pointed out. And so there wasn't really a role for the advisory council to play. So at the time, when I spoke to some of these appointees, they were still sort of uncertain in some ways exactly what their role was going to look like. But generally, people expressed a desire to, again, not to overstate the importance or try to equate this to consultation, but really to think of it as helping the federal government understand how it can best work with communities, because there's a lot often crossed wires there, and that doesn't help anyone. And there was a lot of criticism as well because this this council was appointed, not elected, as some people would have preferred. Not certain organizations like the Assembly of First Nations weren't consulted in that appointment process. Other rights holding organizations were. I know at least Makavik, Inuit treaty organizations got to put forward some names. So there's still a lot of the whole process is still kind of shrouded in uncertainty. And one of the members that I spoke to, she told me that she fully understands why people are concerned and have a lot of doubts about what type of influence this council will actually have. She even said that in the past, she's seen these sorts of advisory councils, at various levels, basically just be symbolic and not have much impact. So obviously, she hopes that's not the case here, and she's there to advocate for her region. And it still remains to be seen how the council will function and what sort of influence it'll be able to exert. But a lot of people on that council, their view is that it's a bigger risk to not be involved, despite some of the valid critiques that have been brought about it. So I think, that'll be something to keep a close eye on because relations have been a little rocky between the Carney government. He doesn't necessarily have the same tact as Trudeau had, over whether or not people agree with that.
Jump in. I think one of the things we're going to need over the next couple of years is a much deeper coverage of Indigenous politics. There's a kind of, people tend to treat it as a monolithic entity, or the loudest voice is the one that you assume speaks for everybody. It's much more complicated, much more divided. A linear project like a pipeline might have 40 to 50 nations along there. And everyone that I can think of, there were nations that supported it and there were nations that opposed it. What's a poor provincial government supposed to do? It's easier with a mine where they might, it's geographically specific and there are 2 or 3 nations and you can try to get consent, from and agreements with them. But each of them presents differently. As soon as the AFN starts to speak up about something, local leaders will say, well, you're not the rights holders, we are. You only can advocate for us, but we're the rights holders. So it gets very complicated very quickly, and that's fine. But I think that the coverage that most Canadians hear, there's a kind of tentativeness and a scared to actually unpack Indigenous politics as politics. There's going to be a lot of internal discussions and differences between nations, between political organizations, between individuals. It's a form of politics, and we don't really cover it very well.
How much of a factor was this in the Trudeau government? Because he came to power talking about the fact that there was no other relationship that was more important. So how much of a challenge was that?
Well, they made a bet on the AFN and their relationship with the AFN. They kicked 2 of the national Indigenous organizations out of the consultation circle. There used to be 5 under the Harper government. They cut it to 3, and they tried to negotiate directly with the AFN, and they had some success, getting to child family services legislation and language legislation. That cuts no ice when you're dealing with rights holders, and the duty to consult and the ability to challenge a port project in Quebec or whatever. So you ultimately have to go to the community level, and there's no part of British Columbia where First Nations claims don't overlap with each other. In Ottawa, there are 9 different Algonquin entities and their claims overlap with each other. So there's going to have to be some dispute resolution. Governments have to make a decision about how much consent is enough, who speaks for whom. The courts can only sort of nudge people along. This is going to be with us, for as long as Section 35 and 25 are there, and governments and private sector proponents are going to have to learn how to manage very, very complicated relationships. It is, just to wrap up on that, I think it is the biggest risk point for a number of these projects, because as John alluded to, unlike sort of NGOs and local communities and whatnot, when you're a rights holder with Section 35 rights, you have standing in the legal process to get injunctions and to hold things up, and that can be, as we've seen, it can be a blocker for projects. It can also be an accelerator if you do have Indigenous partners.
Great point to end this section with. Now I want to pivot to some audience questions, and we'll try to get as many in as we can within the next 15 minutes or so. And John, I've got a question for you. This is from Monique. What is the most promising climate-friendly project on the first, second, or third tranche?
That is okay. That's an interesting one. Most promising. I mean, right now, I guess I would say Wind West, this project to build offshore wind off the coast of Nova Scotia, but there's some significant caveats there. Um, One of the reasons I would think it's the most promising is in terms of its clear-cut potential to do something. Wind energy is good. Wind could be to Nova Scotia, what oil was to Texas. But there's a huge but here. In Atlantic Canada, there is, and I say this as someone who used to live in Atlantic Canada and reported there in the energy space. It's a region that is always on the hunt for the next big thing, and often it doesn't go particularly well. In recent years, we've seen, oh, tidal energy is going to be a big win, or hydrogen is going to be a big for us. Hydro projects are going to be big for us, and they never go particularly well. And I think that's the risk here with Wind West. It is a major project, could supply a tremendous amount of electricity. But if it's going to be successful, I think it's going to have to be in stages. They're not going to be able to bite off the whole thing and go for it. It's going to have to just be developing it in stages along the way. I think there are some other interesting ones to see. Like high-speed rail, I do think is an interesting project. I wouldn't exactly say it's a sure bet, though. It's incredibly complicated. The routing of it is incredibly difficult to do, and it's going to take a long time to do. The last estimate was, we could go from Carney said he wants to aim for having a plan in 4 years. We're not even talking about shovels in the ground. We're talking about aspirationally having a plan in 4 years. But there's some potential in it because if you could have high-speed rail connecting the Toronto to Quebec City corridor, then all of a sudden, climate solutions that weren't previously on the table, like, say, banning short-haul flights, those become possible because there are other alternatives. So I guess those are the ones that immediately come to mind, but only because there haven't been a lot of a lot of particularly promising climate mega projects announced so far.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks for that, John. Darius, I've got a question for you from Dorothy. And speaking of projects, Dorothy wonders, why is Carney not pushing renewables?
Well, yeah, again, maybe we could have flipped the questions and John could have taken the political one and I could have taken the the greenest project question.
Give it a shot.
Yes. Well, I think again, these are always. I was living in London when Mark Carney was governor of the Bank of England, and I had the opportunity to see him speak many times. And I'm still holding out a hope that there is a real intelligence by stealth at work here. That he's paying down some political debts. He's working through some, political sort of fiats almost to these things that must be done to get moving forward. But fundamentally, yeah, it worries me, like I'm sure it worries Dorothy and many others, that the messaging is very old energy, very old industry. I think when you look at a project like Wind West, I'm sure I would join John in saying there are definitely some buts along with that may unsettle that project in some way. But I do think that it has a lot going for it insofar as there's a lot of American money gathering at the gates now for this because, as we all know, Trump has effectively shut down the U.S. offshore wind industry. This is not a new project insofar as there were 5 gigawatts planned for auction for leasing for many years now. It's a world-class wind resource. It's as good as the North Sea or anywhere else in the world. So the actual harnessing of that resource, will be hyper efficient. The beauty to my mind is what always undermined these sort of the clean energy projects, offshore clean energy projects, including tidal, was there's no route to market. You only had 400,000 people living in Halifax, and beyond that, where does this power go? But now you have the U.S. Northeast now with a trunk line that would connect Wind West, and it's 40 to 60 gigawatts, understand. So that's twice as much wind as has been built off the UK. already. It's a massive power source for not just the region, but in theory, 27% of the country. So I think it sort of straddles these best of two worlds reality from my mind. And why that wasn't in the first tranche of projects, well, again, arguably, as Natasha raised too, these were projects that were already so well underway. They were low-hanging fruit. They were going to be things that could be done quickly, in keeping with Mark Carney's ambitions to be, fast and furious in these things. But indeed, the way I see it, there are these projects. We have great natural wind, we have great insulation. We have as much sun hitting Canada as Germany does, but we have 1/5 of the installed capacity Germany does. I mean, renewables is an eventuality, but unfortunately, Alberta was our powerhouse for renewables, and with the moratorium in 2023, we lost a lot of traction there. I think don't give up on renewables by any stretch of the imagination. It is the cheapest, quickest to deploy. That's something we haven't touched on. If we want to build things quickly, and we're talking sort of 2 to 5 years for a wind or solar project versus 15, 20, 30, 40 years for a nuclear power project, or indeed a major LNG project, renewables is the only way to go.
And I guess, with the big guy south of the border doing everything he can to deep six renewables, hard for major political leaders here to talk it up, right?
Yeah, again, and I've had conversations with various industry associations who say, yeah, we've had dozens of developers, and not U.S. and international to be sure, who are looking very seriously. This is offshore wind principally, but also solar as well. There's no question. It's just, again, it's politics trumping economics, if I can use the verb.
You can, yes.
Yeah, there's no question that we should be steaming ahead with renewables. And again, I think part of this too comes back to the simple fact that we've been blessed with so much hydropower for so long. It's made us a bit complacent, frankly. We've always had clean energy, so far as you consider hydro to be clean energy. And so I think it hasn't been the same sort of incentive to really build out the new clean power in wind and solar. And prices have collapsed, as we all know. So there's no economic argument to not be pushing ahead. Why is Carney doing this again? I'm really hoping that we're going to see these first 5 projects sort of disappear in the rearview mirror, and the ones that really are going to allow Canada to become that energy superpower that Carney claims he wants to make us take shape.
Let me ask you that, Michael. Jump in on this one. Why is Carney not pushing renewables?
Well, he may not need to. I mean, to jump on it, the shift is happening due to market forces. There was a coal auction in the States where coal was valued at a penny a metric ton, and solar's coming online at, whatever it is, well under 2 cents a kilowatt hour. So people will make investment decisions without a need for a lot of tax incentives and subsidies, as they make the people that are busy building out AI data centers, which is the biggest capital expenditure in North America these days, are looking for reliable power, and they are looking for renewables or nuclear as a source. So, a lot of your audience may not agree, but one of the more promising things on that project list is the nuclear one. And there will be a big fork in the road decision once that technology sort of comes to a point where they have to decide whether to deploy it or not. The French and the Swedes and the Poles have made big bets on nuclear. Britain sort of goes back and forth on it and so on. So, we'll have to decide whether, the GHG savings are worth the risk. That's a big political coming attraction trailer, if I can put it that way. But, I would add one other thing, which I think, Darius alluded to. It can be deployed at scale without, it doesn't have to be big major projects. Obviously, there are some that are important, but it's going to be deployed at a very, retail consumer level as people add snap-on panels to their apartment balconies and so on and so on. I'd add the sort of implementation angle, and maybe we can come back to later. I'm sure most of you have read the Flyberg-Gardner book, How Big Things Get Done. And he goes through sort of how major projects are managed around the world. And there's an interesting chart on which ones tend to have the most cost overruns and time delays, and which are and there's the worst, absolute worst is high-speed rail. And the best is deployment of solar power, which is now so standardized that you can deploy at scale very, very, very fast, as opposed to high-speed rail will probably be a 20-year adventure.
Mm-hmm. Natasha, Oh,
Quick
go
shout
ahead.
out to
Go ahead.
geothermal. I should have mentioned geothermal because we do need
Yeah.
base load. And geothermal is coming on leaps and bounds now. We have literally a million times the power, the resource in this country to power the country. So, again, we have drilling technology, which is applicable. I mean, the Albertans are doing it first because, they can. They've got the tech, they've got the people, they got the skills. Sorry, I should add that in my first comment, and it just slipped my mind.
Well, there you go. There you go. I have a question for you, Natasha, and there is a geothermal reference to this. So, Darius, you can feel free to jump into this one as well. And Natasha, this is a question from Barry. Natasha has pointed out that the North is not connected to the energy grid. Now, this makes the use of alternative energy sources presumably an attractive prospect. Deep thermal energy development is an obvious candidate, and its development would be valuable for the rest of the country. Can this be included in projects for the North, and can this be added to the expanded defense budget calculation? Natasha, you want to take a run at that one?
Yeah, for sure. And then I'll throw it back to Darius for some geothermal because it's a super interesting topic and he's been all over it lately. I mean, I think the question you raised about whether it can be added to the expanded defense budget calculation is a good one and something to keep an eye on. Because like I'm sure most of you on here know, Carney upped our pledge to 5% of GDP towards military capabilities by 2035. So, that's a ways off, but 3.5% of that is going to be on the typical stuff that you would expect, further investments in the armed forces, equipment, technology, modernizing all of that. But 1.5% of that is, sorry, an additional 1.5% of GDP will be dedicated to investments in things that are sort of like dual use or, boosting our security and defense capabilities. And that can be anything from new airports, ports, roads, communications, emergency preparedness systems, which obviously has a tie-in with climate change. And I would imagine that a lot of the stuff you're referring to, Barry, especially anything that, bolsters the resilience of the electricity grid and gets that hooked up, would be a pretty compelling argument for something that is dual use and could probably go into that bucket. I'm not a defense expert, so we'll have to see how it plays out, but I think that's something to watch. And Darius, I don't know if you have any thoughts to add on geothermal in the North specifically, but I think that's a really interesting area to dig into as well.
Dig into exactly. Yeah, no, I mean, geothermal has always been held back by the fact that you could only drill into certain hot spots to actually get the temperature you need to heat the water to drive the steam. But the technologies that we've seen, these enhanced and advanced geothermal technologies that are coming toward commercialization now don't require that. We have a very world leading company called EVOR that's been around for some time. They're building their first pilot in Germany, but they use a closed loop circuit system. A closed loop system, which again is highly efficient, and you don't there's a kind of a zero loss thing, so you can run this thing for as long as you like. The data center connection is very interesting because again, we don't necessarily need nuclear or more gas or anything else if we could attach geothermal to these data centers, and it's steady. It runs kind of forever. It's a wonderful resource that is singularly unexploited in this country. So I think that's again, I just finished a piece. I dropped it in the chat chain if anyone wants to click through and read the long read we did recently on it. I think this dual use point is an interesting one too. It does sort of tangential in some regards, but we stopped talking about the energy transition. We started talking mainly about energy security. So effectively, when you look at the ports in Canada, if you look at Novaport out in Sydney, Nova Scotia, they are pushing to get NATO status. This will allow them to obviously serve as a base for NATO construction work, but they also would then do offshore wind turbines and foundations and so on. So how much are we going to see of that kind of the dual use approach to strategy when it comes to getting renewables built out? Again under the aegis of it also being part of energy security and
just quickly, David, that's an important point Darius just made. We don't get to self-assess. It's the NATO accountants in Brussels who assess what counts and what doesn't, and they have their methodologies and so on. Maloney in Italy is trying to convince them that a bridge to Sicily should count as a military infrastructure and so on. Every NATO member is going to try to game the system.
Yeah.
This is another really big challenge. Like 5% of a $3 trillion economy is $150 billion a year. So we're in for some very, very big discussions about fiscal priorities. Dual use and two-fers and three-fers are going to be very, very appealing to any government.
I have one final question I'm going to try to squeeze in here, and it's for you, Michael. You have the floor, so you can stay right there. It's from, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Anon. It's a very long question, so I'll try my best to resume it here. There are a lot of projects that are being pushed forward. Are there, at the end of the day, going to be a lot of gaps in the system, a lot of stuff that just doesn't end up getting done?
Well, I mean, that's up to the investors. I mean, if the government is the owner and the proprietor and the investor, there's a greater chance, we want to build this thing, it'll get built, or, unless the government reverses it, which governments come and go, and red becomes blue and blue becomes red, projects get canceled for sure. There are lots of projects in Canada and around the world that got their permits, and then the investor said, "Yeah, actually, I'll pocket the permit and go somewhere else." And I think that's the part of the debate that Canadians, we get sort of all absorbed in our own thing. They don't really appreciate the intense international competition. When people are making multi-billion-dollar bets on mines and ports and container ports and energy supply, they're looking at a map, and they're looking at risk and geopolitical risk and, and the economics, and making bets about what currency and interest rates are going to look like, and commodity prices and so on. And, we may make heroic efforts and issue a lot of permits, and some of them are going to get canceled. You saw that with Stellantis, in the auto sector just this week. Like, at the end of the day, if they're private sector projects, the private sector investor is going to decide.
And is there anything that a Carney government or anyone else can do to reverse that? Or
no,
basically private sector money goes where private sector money goes?
Kinder Morgan decided to walk away from a pipeline so that the government nationalized it. I don't think, We'll see whether Canadian governments want to get heavily into owning and operating infrastructure again. They did it for the St. Lawrence Seaway. They did it for the Trans-Canada Highway. They've taken equity stakes in things like Prince Rupert terminals and so on. Governments were the original investors in Suncor and Syncrude. People forget that, So, taxpayers taking a share of the risk in projects is something we've always done, all the way back to the CPR and the Transcontinental Railway, and governments will continue to do that. So I think whether we have sort of conservative or liberal governments, for the next 10 years, they will be trying to attract, projects that create jobs and growth and revenues. Managing that with the overlay of the energy transition and the climate challenges is going to be a big challenge for them. But as I said earlier, they're having the same conversation in London and Berlin and Paris.
Okay. Well, I've got some bad news. We're going to have to wrap this up. I could keep going. I could keep going on for a while, though I know that Michael wants to get to the Blue Jays game. So, before we do wrap things up, I just want to give these very smart people a chance just to leave us with some parting thoughts. So I'm going to start in the reverse order. So, Michael, why don't we start with you?
I think, not to be repetitive, I'm actually fairly optimistic that the market forces and the sort of imperatives around the energy transition are going to ultimately decide a lot of the outcomes here. We may not see the final results on some of these things for 5, 7, 10 years and whatnot. In the short term, I think this is very much about establishing some momentum and some urgency and dispelling this sort of reputation, which is partly earned, that Canada is a hard place for things to get built. And we're going to have to get better at it because the competition from other markets and other countries is unrelenting. Every capital is sitting around dealing with the prospect of Donald Trump and Donald Trump being succeeded by Vance and so on, and saying, we have to be more self-sufficient. We have to create more wealth and more jobs, with our own brains and ingenuity. But I think I'm optimistic, actually, that this is something Canada's good at.
Now, optimism is good. Natasha.
Yeah, I mean, there were so many great questions in the chat. I wish we had time for more of them, but I really enjoyed how people were asking questions that went outside of the pipeline discourse. It's obviously hugely consequential, but I'm excited going forward to try to, really interrogate some of the less explored parts of this major projects push, whether that's, the defense side, and yeah, I think that, like Michael said as well, I'm very curious to see if we're going to get improved media coverage of Indigenous politics, because it's a very rich world. I know some great reporters on the Hill who are doing a great job, but we need more of that. So we have a great team here. We'll be doing our best and looking forward to it.
Darius.
Well, I think this is a reindustrialization, and it's nothing less than as consequential as the Industrial Revolution. We are going to have to shift in this country from being a petrostate effectively to being an electrotech state. And as an electrostate, China obviously rules the world, but we are in a unique position because we do have extraordinary natural resources in this country: wind, solar, tidal, critical minerals, rare earths. It's really a question of whether I think we want to get behind, back ourselves as the horse to win the race. I'll just offer the quickest of anecdotes. There's a fellow who used to run Neo Performance Materials. He's a man named Konstantin Karyanopoulos. He just stepped down from the CEO role, but this company has just built a permanent magnet factory in Narva, Estonia. Now, this is a $100 million factory. He would like to have bought it. He would like to have built it here in Canada, he said, but frankly, he said he couldn't get to see the minister in charge. He went to Estonia. He spoke to the prime minister. It got built in 500 days. So now they're supplying magnets to Bosch and Siemens and various automakers in Europe. They've got demand. They're building supply. We could be doing it here. This applies to every facet of the industrial landscape right now in this country. It just needs to be done.
John.
Well, okay, I'm going to pick up on this, maybe a bit of a cliche at this point, but I mean the crossroads that we're at, right? And I think what this country needs to kind of get past this petrostate problem that we have is to kind of be able to recognize that the fossil fuel industry and its petro block of allies does have predictable narratives, right? So when they talk about Northern Gateway, it is, well, we need to diversify away from Trump. And then the next week, when we hear about Keystone XL further connecting us with the United States, it's, yeah, that's great too. It's not about, for them, it's just about expanding production in the oil patch. And so I think we need to be able to identify these arguments when we hear them, set them aside, debunk them, whatever we need to do. Because this is the choice. Are we going to actually continue being the petrostate, or are we going to develop a modern economy? Earlier this year, Mark Carney talked about, we can't go back to this relationship with the US. We have to find new trading partners. And he did say that, from his perspective at least, there are some industries like fossil fuels and others, but fossil fuels being the big one, where we can't disentangle from the United States easily, but we have an opportunity to build new trade relationships in the emerging economies of tomorrow, like renewables, like clean tech. So this is really the conversation. This is what this major projects agenda could be all about. But it's political, as we've been talking about, and politics, for better or worse, I often think it is less about what an individual happens to believe and much more about what pressure is put to bear on them. How they're pressured from the provinces, how they're pressured from people, how they're pressured from lobbyists, corporations, you name it. But I think politics comes down to pressure a lot of the time, and that's what's going to decide whether we get on the path we need to get on.
Thank you very much. John Woodside, Michael Wernick, Darius Snieckus, Natasha Bulowski. Thank you very much. Great conversation. So that's all the time we have. We're out of time. Huge thanks to you folks, for everyone who joined us. If you enjoyed this conversation, please make sure to subscribe to Canada's National Observer for more in-depth analysis and coverage. on the issues we discussed today and to keep more events like this one going. And if you miss any part of this event, don't worry, we'll be posting a full recording on our YouTube channel soon. Thanks again for joining us for CNO Live, the next big bills inside Carney's policy playbook. Have a great evening, everyone. Go Jays, go.